Greetings everyone! Today we're going to explore solving by completing the square. Let's do a quick review. In this example, if I am asked to factor and solve, I would be able to set up my AC method, first times last, or A times C, my B value, factors of 20 that can give me an 8. In this case, that would be 2 and 10. I have to watch my signs. One of them has to be negative. In this case, the 10 would be negative. That means my new middle terms are positive 2x and negative 10x. I then have my 4 terms that I can set up grouping. Because they're both negative, I'm going to divide out a negative 10. I then have my common factor of x plus 2, which leaves me with x minus 10. When I set each factor equal to 0, I end up with my solutions of x equals negative 2 or x equals 10. So we've spent a day factoring and solving. We then spend today dealing with what if it wasn't factorable. Then I want to isolate the x. So we would add 5. We would then square root. And when we square root, we have to remember plus or minus. We then worked on reducing radicals to arrive at our final solution of plus or minus 2 square roots of 3. But what happens if neither of those options work? For example, in this case, if I multiply first and last, I have 1, but my middle term is 4. There's no factors of 1 that can get me to 4. I also have 3 terms, so I can't use difference of squares. If I try to move stuff to one side, I still have an x squared and an x. So that doesn't get me anywhere either. If you encounter a situation where you can't factor or solve by square roots, we're going to explore 2 options. We're going to explore completing the square, and we're going to explore the quadratic formula. Today, let's concentrate on completing the square. First thing we're going to need is the foldable that I've provided to you. Let's first list the steps to completing the square. Take a moment to pause this video and jot these steps down. All right, let's take a look at the examples in your foldable. We want to follow our 5 steps as we make our way through this problem. The first thing we notice is that I can't factor this problem. There are no factors of 1 that can give me a 4. Therefore, I have to use completing the square. Let's start with our first step. Make sure the leading coefficient is 1, and it is. So I don't really need to do anything for this step. Step 2, move your C value to the other side. So one of the first things you want to do is identify what values you have. Your x squared coefficient is your A, your x coefficient is your B, and your constant is your C. So I want to start by moving my constant to the other side, which means I'll subtract both sides by 1. Pretty easy so far. Step 3, complete the square on the left and add it to both sides. Here are the new steps. To complete the square, you take your B value, you divide by 2, and you square it. That's how we complete the square. It's 2 steps. Divide by 2 and square it. So let's fill in the values we know. We know that our B value is 4. So I'm going to divide by 2 and I'm going to square it. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 squared is 4. This is the one case where your b value and your completing the square value are actually the same. Our steps say on our foldable, add to both sides. So that means on my equation, I'm going to leave a little bit of space, and I'm going to take this new 4 and I'm going to add it to both sides. Let's simplify that right side right away. The left side, we're not going to do anything yet, but the right side simplifies down to 3. Step 4 says to solve. To solve, that left side is now going to be factorable. That's why we did step 3, is so we can factor that left side. So let me show you how it works with AC method, but then we'll talk about a simpler way to remember. If I was to complete the square, A times C is 4, my middle term is 4, which means my middle terms have to be 2 and 2. If I replace my middle 4x with a 2x and a 2x, I can then group, and I end up with an x and an x plus 2, plus a 2 and an x plus 2. We've got a common factor of x plus 2, which leaves me with an x plus 2. Notice this pattern. Our final factors are the same thing because it's a perfect square. So completing the square, that'll always happen. So you don't have to show your AC work every time. Can you? For sure. If that's what makes you feel more comfortable, then definitely do that. But by completing the square, what happens is you end up with 1 parenthesis, square root your first term, and you get an x. Take your middle term and divide by 2. If we just do that one step, that's how we end up with that second value. And we need to end up with the same thing squared, and the right side stays the same. So if I take my b term, which is still 4, and I divide by 2, I end up with 2. Notice how we ended up with x plus 2 twice here. And we can also end up with it just by taking b divided by 2. So on this step, you have to decide how are you going to factor. You will always end up with the same thing twice. Do you want to do AC method? Or do you want to remember the rule that it's the middle term divided by 2? Now we have to continue solving this. My goal is to isolate that x still. Now we're going back to all of our previous lessons. I'm going to square root both sides, which leaves me with an x plus 2 equals the second you square root, make sure you plus minus. Square root of 3 doesn't reduce. There's no I have to worry about, and 3 does not reduce down. So my last step is subtract 2, which leaves me with x equals a negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 3. Remember, we do the real part followed by the imaginary part when we write a complex number. Step 5 says don't forget your plus and minus. We need to be in the habit that the second we see a square root symbol, we see a plus or minus. Let's take a look at another example where the leading coefficient is still 1. That means my first step is done. Make sure your leading coefficient is 1. Let's take care of step 2, which says move C to the other side. I have A, B, C, so I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides, which leaves me with x squared minus 12x equals negative 4. Step 3, completing the square. Remember, we want to take our middle term, divide by 2, and square it. If I follow those steps, I end up with a negative 12 divided by 2 and square it, which gives me a negative 6 squared, which gives me a 36. In that step, it says complete the square on the left and add to both sides. So I'm going to rewrite my step 2 with a little space in there. And I'm going to take that 36 for completing the square and I'm going to add it to both sides. Let's simplify that right side down a little bit. I'm left with a negative 4 plus 36, which leaves me with 32. Step 4. Oh, let's combine step 3 and 4. We still have to finish factoring that left side. Remember the rule. You can use AC method to take care of that left side, or I know I'll end up with the same thing twice. To find out what this term should be, we take b divided by 2, the one step for completing the square. My first value has to be an x. If I take my middle term and I divide by 2, that would be a negative 12 divided by 2 gives me a negative 6. So my factored form is x minus 6 squared. Again, if you'd rather do AC method, you are certainly welcome to stick to that same process every time. Just know that this is a shortcut to get you to that answer of x minus 6 squared quicker. Now we can solve. Now we can isolate that x. Everything is being squared, so I'm going to square root both sides. The second you square root, I need to see a plus or minus. Let's take care of reducing that radical. 32 reduces down to 16 times 2. I'm left with an x minus 6 on the left, a plus or minus. Square root of 16 is equal to 4, and we have square root of 2 left over. Now I want to isolate that x, so I'm going to add 6 to both sides. Now those aren't like terms, so I can't actually add them, so I'm going to leave the 6 out front, plus or minus the 4, and the radical 2 stays the same. In this case, I have it in complex standard form, the real part followed by the imaginary part. So that is my final solution. Let's take a look at one more example. In this case, we have a number in front of the x squared now, so we actually have to utilize step 1. Now I know these steps can be a lot your first time around. So as you're taking these notes, you're trying to listen and write at the same time. My suggestion is, after you've taken your notes, re-watch this video where you can just listen and watch. Really pay attention. You need to watch and listen more than once if you truly want to understand the concept. So in this case, for step 1, it says make sure the leading coefficient is 1. And in this case, I have 2. So to take care of it, you divide every term by that leading coefficient, which gives me my new equation of x squared plus 4x plus 7 equals 0. That's the only new step from the previous 2 questions. Step 2 says move c to the other side. I have my a value, my b value, my c value. Remember your a value is now 1. So I'm going to subtract 7 from both sides. For step 2, I now have x squared plus 4x equals -7. Now I'm going through this process because that equation the way it is not factorable. If you can AC it, oh my goodness, do that every time. But in this case, I can't. So this is my option as of right now, completing the square. Step 3 says complete the square on the left and add it to both sides. That means take your b value, divide it by 2, and square it. So in this particular problem, my b value is 4. I'm going to divide by 2 and square it. This leaves me with 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 squared is 4. Take that 4 and add it to both sides. Next, I can simplify that right side. That's a quick fix. Keep the left side as is, and we end up with a -3 on the right. Next, I want to actually factor that left side. If you want to use AC method, please stop the video and practice AC method at this point. If you remember the rule is we end up with a binomial squared. How we determine what value it is we take our b value and divide by 2. So in this case, if I take my b value and I divide by 2, it's just 2. So I'm going to add 2 on the inside. So it's the same as saying x plus 2 times x plus 2, but we're going to say squared. We have it twice. If you used AC method, you should have arrived at that same solution on the left. Step 4 says to solve. I'm going to start off by square rooting both sides. By doing that, I'm taking care of the squared. Excuse me. Remember that when you square root both sides, you can't forget your plus and minus in front of your radical. Next, I'm going to subtract the 2 from both sides. I want to isolate that x value. I end up with an x, a -2, a plus or minus, a square root of -3. We do not leave negatives under the radical. We need to take that negative out so it becomes an I. Square root of 3 does not reduce, but we need to make sure, so we're going to leave it as I square root of 3. Step 5 says don't forget your plus and minus, which we already have that in our work. So our final solution is x equals -2 plus or minus I radical 3. It's in standard form, meaning real part followed by imaginary part. So again, on these questions on completing the square, that step 3 is going to be the toughest part to remember. So rewatch this video. Practice b divided by 2 squared, b divided by 2 squared if you need to do some repetition or find a way to remember that. So just a quick overview. Key points. Follow those 5 steps. Be careful on step 3. You want to take your b value, divide by 2 and square it. That's the key completing the square point. When you write out your factors, you'll end up with b divided by 2 for the second part of that term. For your homework, complete the rest of those foldable examples. We did 3 together. There's 3 more for you to finish. And again, rewatch the video without writing anything down. And if you have any questions, make it a point to see me after class.